Hibernate, JPA, JQL, SQL. What the hell? Marco codes! Hi, Marco here. In this video, you're going to learn Hibernate and JPA. Nah, not really. Why? Because that would be quite the promise. In fact, it's going to take you months, if not years, of deliberate practice with Hibernate and, by the way, SQL to fully understand what you're doing. So I'm not going to show you 10,000 features of Hibernate you're not going to remember anyway. Instead, I'm going to show you a couple of very important general concepts, and I'm going to give you pointers along the way for your learning journey in the future. Sounds like fun? Let's go. First off, what problem does Hibernate solve? Imagine you have a good old relational database. Doesn't matter if it's Postgres, MySQL, or what have you. Now imagine I have a users database table. The table comes with an ID column, name column, birth date column, 2 rows inside. There's 2 users. One user is called Marco. The other user has the funky name Okram. Now, at the same time, in my Java project, I have a user class. And surprisingly, that user class has an ID field, name field, birth date field. The question is, how do I easily get the data from my database table and put it into user objects, for example? Also, if I have a user object on the Java side, how can I easily save it, for example, to my database table called users without having to do crazy string concatenation? And that essentially is the core problem that Hibernate solves, among 20,000 other things. Now, the thing is, Hibernate is one of the many options in the Java world how to do that. It is a very popular option. I'm not saying it's the best option out there, but in any case, it helps to understand how it works. So let's get it set up. Let's start with something very basic, the dependencies you need to get Hibernate up and running. Why is that so important? Because nowadays people, they use, for example, Spring Boot, includes Spring Data JPA, which includes like 100 libraries, among them Hibernate, and they think, well, Hibernate is this huge complex stack of libraries you need to include. Not so. What you need to do is open up your POM.xml file if you're using Maven, or your build.gradle file if you're using Gradle, and then paste in one tiny dependency. It's the Hibernate-core dependency, 6.1.2 final at the time of this recording, but the specific version doesn't actually matter too much. Then, if you're using an IDE like IntelliJ, load the Maven changes, right, so the dependency gets pulled down, and that's all you need to do. That's it. All right, so we have the dependency set up, and now comes the question, how do we tell Hibernate to map the user class to a database table called users? And how do we tell Hibernate that ID, name, and birth date should be mapped to the respective columns ID, name, birth date in the database? Annotations to the rescue. In fact, you just have to annotate your class with Hibernate-specific annotations, the first one being the addEntity annotation. addEntity is just a mark annotation. It tells Hibernate, hey, this class is special. I want to map it to the database table. That's it. Then by default, what Hibernate would do is take a user class and try and map it to a database table called user. Ours is called users, hence we have to use another annotation, table, and we're just going to specify the name here, table name equals users. Then to continue, IntelliJ already shows you, hey, the user should have a primary key. That's right, it's important for Hibernate to know which field is the primary key. You might have guessed correctly. 2 more annotations for that. ID, and there's also one which is called a generated value. Just quickly, we have a database column ID, which auto increments an ID. It's an identity column essentially. And we also have to tell Hibernate, hey, this is an identity column. Please don't, for example, generate an ID yourself. More on that in a second. For now, let's just leave it at that. Then Hibernate is smart enough to understand, well, ID, the name should be mapped to ID. Same with, by the way, a string name. It's a simple type string, and it maps directly to the name column, so we don't need anything else. Just with the birth date column, I think in our database it's called birth_date, right? So what we could do is we could add the addColumn annotation here, and again, give it the name of birth_date to map it correctly. And then the usual, you just need to make sure that your class has an empty constructor. I mean, if you don't have any auxiliary constructors, you don't actually need that. But as soon as you have an auxiliary constructor like here, string name birth date, you need to at least have one empty constructor. So Hibernate can actually construct empty objects when it fetches data out of the database table and fill in this data. It doesn't work if you just left out that constructor now, because Hibernate wouldn't know by default. There's ways around that, how to construct a user object. So just make sure that's in. A common mistake to have. Other than that, that's it. Now, you might still have 20 million questions, and I'm going to tell you what. There's a great book out there, which I recommend everyone to read, Java Persistence with Hibernate. It has roughly 600, 700 pages, and I think about 200 of them are on mapping annotations. So I can't put those 200 pages into this tiny video and show you how to do many-to-one, one-to-many, one-to-one relationships and whatnot. You'll have to work through the book. You actually have to read it and work through all these examples. Otherwise, it just won't work. All right, so we've got the dependency, we've got the mapping annotations. Now it's time to write some code. What I did is I prepared a tiny test class, which has one test method showing off the problem I've been talking about. In fact, I want to have a user object from my database table, and I don't yet know how. So what I did is I went to Hibernate's Getting Started manual, and I copy and pasted some code and put it inside here. Don't worry, I'm going to walk you through it, because there's no way you're going to come up with that code yourself. At the end, what you want to have is a SessionFactory. A SessionFactory essentially is Hibernate. So it's all about constructing a SessionFactory now. For that, there's some funky code here with a standard service registry, configure build, new metadata sources registry, build metadata, build SessionFactory, whatever. What you need to know is that this code essentially here has a look at a configuration file to configure Hibernate. It's called Hibernate config XML. It was conveniently hidden away. And again, when I look inside the XML file, I can see there seems to be, well, a SessionFactory tag, and I can set a couple of properties. For example, I can tell the SessionFactory, hey, what database do you want me to connect to? I'm connecting to an H2 database, so it's not MySQL or Postgres in this example, but it doesn't really matter. So you just put your database URL inside here. Also, username, password, the correct driver class. You need to tell Hibernate when it creates SQL statements, what SQL dialect it should use. In this case, H2. For MySQL database, it will be MySQL dialect. And you can tell Hibernate about stuff like, hey, please print out all the SQL statements that you're executing. But most importantly, you need to tell Hibernate, hey, I have one special class, the user class. Hence, you need a mapping tag, and you tell Hibernate, hey, here is my user class. My user class has the special entity annotation and a couple of other annotations. And now, once you boot up and once you have a look at all these classes and configuration files and you create the SessionFactory, then you can actually use Hibernate to store your objects into the database and also execute queries to get them out again. Let's see how that works. All right, let's start with something simple and let's try and save a user object to our database table. In fact, I'm going to comment out this test down here, which you can fill in after having watched this video. For now, I'm just going to create a new test method, call it save my first object to the DB, right? And then obviously it starts with the SessionFactory. What I want to do is I want to create a new session. For now, a session, you can think of it as just a database connection, nothing else. That's actually not quite true, but for now, that's completely fine. I'm just going to wrap this with a try with resources block, and here we go. So the session is going to get closed again as well. Now, what we want to do is we want to be good citizens. So we always, want to start a new transaction whenever we work with the database. At the end, what we're also going to do is we're going to get that transaction and commit it, right? And in between here is where our saving should happen. And actually, it's rather simple. What we're going to do is we're going to call session persist, right? And we have to put in a user. We don't have that user yet. Actually, let me just, that was a bit nonsensical. What we can do up here is new user equals new user Lisa, for example, with a birth date of now, right? So we're just telling Hibernate, hey, here, please do the magic, take the user object, convert it to SQL, send it to a database table. And this is just some infrastructure plumbing so far. Well, let's try it out. Let's run our project. Let's see what happens. Let's see what the console says. And you can see that Hibernate, there's a lot of Hibernate comments here in the log. There is a statement insert into users ID, birthday, name, values, default, yes, yes, yes. So it looks like Hibernate indeed did something. And when we have a look at the database table, let's see, right here is Lisa. Look at that. So it worked. And that's essentially how you persist. That means save, update users to a database table. You could also remove them from the database that way. And now it's time to have a look at queries. All right, let's try and get our users out of the database again. And we're going to do that with the help of HQL, which is Hibernate's query language. It's similar to SQL, even though SQL works on database tables and HQL works on class hierarchies. Let's see what that means actually. So I'm going to create a new test method, HQL fetch users, something like that. I'm just going to copy and paste the code up here for the plumbing. So opening session, begin transaction, closing it again. And inside here, what we want to do is we're going to write session.createQuery because we want to write an HQL query. Now here goes the first parameter is your query. The second parameter is the type of the result objects, which are users in my case. So we're just going to go with user class. And now the question is, what is the query going to look like? Very similar to SQL. So we're going to do select U from user U, for example. We want to fetch all users right now. And as you can see, this doesn't reference a database table. It actually references the name of your entity. So select user U, right? If I wanted to say, for example, u.birthdate, I would also specify the birthdate variable, the birthday field, not the birthdate underscore column name, right? So you're effectively working on your classes / objects here, not on the database tables. For now, I just want to select every user, right? And at the end of it, I'm going to call list. And that should give me a nice little list of users effectively, right? That's what it looks like. And now we're just going to go through our users. For every user, we're just going to go system out, print, and we're going to print out the user to the console. And by the way, let's give our user a nicer toString method, right? That's it. We're going to go back here. We're going to run our HQL fetch users test. Let's see what actually happens. Again, Hibernate boots up, which means the SessionFactory is being constructed. And when you have a look down here, you can see that Hibernate executed the select birthday name ID from users, right? And you have the user object printed out to the console. Pretty damn cool. Which means actually for you here, getting a specific user shouldn't be that much of a problem. What you'll have to find out is how to specify parameters inside HQL queries, set those parameters, and then just get one user back instead of a whole list of users. That, again, the whole HQL topic, another 100 pages in the book I mentioned early on with the mapping annotations. So read those pages, figure out how it works, fix the test down here, because I can't spoon feed you everything. You have to get going with Hibernate yourself and build up some experience. This brings us to the topic of JPA, the Java Persistence API. Now, what's JPA? The thing is, I already told you there's multiple tools like Hibernate, Eclipse Link, OpenJPA, Data Nucleus, a couple other ones. And committees at some point in the far, far past got together and thought, hey, it would be nice to have some sort of a baseline interface, JPA, that all these tools need to conform to, and they can add their own features if they want to. But in the end, my code then will make sure to not use any Hibernate-specific classes, but just JPA-specific classes, and I can plug in Hibernate at the end and let Hibernate do the saving. Well, did that make sense to you? If not, I'm going to show you exactly what that means in code. Well, so far, we constructed a SessionFactory down here, right? And we always open up sessions. When you have a look at the imports, you can see that sessions and SessionFactory come from the org.hibernate package. Now, in JPA speak, what we need instead is not a SessionFactory, but an entity manager factory, right? And sessions in JPA speak are not called sessions, but entity manager. The interesting thing is that a Hibernate session, in fact, is an entity manager. Hence, I can simply swap out the type And a Hibernate SessionFactory already is an entity manager factory. That's why this actually up here works and doesn't throw any errors. So that code is already JPAified. And when you have a look at the top now, these imports, well, for the SessionFactory, it's gone. We're using the session at some other place, but let's get rid of that as well. But you can see that here, the two imports are now basically to the Java APA interface classes. Let me just scroll down because there's a couple of things we need to open up, to clear up. It's not called open session anymore. It's called create entity manager. And then begin transaction has a slightly different API, like session get transaction begin, for example. And I think this is not auto-closable anymore, right, like so. But as you can see, this part already we JPAified. I'm just going to fix the code down here and come back in a second, and we're going to continue from there. All right, so I cleaned everything up. I just renamed the variables. Remember, session is now entity manager. SessionFactory is entity manager factory. I just renamed the variables here. In fact, the code is almost the same. .list got renamed to get result list, for example. Now, in fact, I'm not using HQL anymore. I'm using JPQL, the Java Persistence Query Language, which is a subset of HQL, if you want to put it that way. HQL has a couple more features. JPQL is the standardized version, so to speak. But in fact, the code looks pretty much the same. We got rid of all the Hibernate-specific imports, except for building our SessionFactory here. So that obviously we can't get rid of because there must be a persistence provider, a so-called provider, which is Hibernate in that case. And you just plug in Hibernate, you boot it up, and Hibernate will understand all the JPA-specific annotations. By the way, if you paid attention in your user class, for example, all these annotations we put in earlier, they are already not Hibernate-specific, but actually JPA-specific. Now, what does that mean in practice? In practice, what I now could do is I could say, well, I'm going to replace Hibernate with Eclipse Link tomorrow, and then on Friday with Data Nucleus. It's not going to happen, even though there's always some commenter on Reddit who claims they do it basically every day. Still, it's good practice to basically code against the JPA annotations and the JPA API, and whenever you need specific features from Hibernate on top, then you just use them. And if you're using a framework like Spring Data, for example, the choice has already been made for you. But that's all there is to JPA. This brings us to Hibernate's Criteria API / dynamic SQL. Why is that important? Because imagine you have a complex form. It doesn't even have to be a complex form, a couple of fields. Depending on what dropdowns, for example, you select, you want to generate different SQL statements on the backend. You can either do that by doing string concatenation with your HQL queries, what some people do. Number two is you build your own query builder framework, which I've seen in almost every company I was at in the past, different frameworks. Number three, you can use Hibernate's Criteria API. It's a bit wacky to use, but it does the job. Now, I just copy and pasted some code in here because there's no way I would have been able to write that myself. I'm just going to go through that once with you. We need an entity manager. We need a criteria builder because we want to create a criteria query. Now, criteria builder, please let me create a query where I get users out of it. User.class is the result type of the query. And then you construct the query, the criteria query, as if it was an SQL query, but it looks a bit convoluted. So please, criteria query from my user table, essentially, users table. I want to do a select where the column user_.name, we have to talk about that in a second, equals Marco. It is actually so difficult to even talk you through this, but this is the code that it looks like. And obviously, if you had different conditions here, you could put them into the where, you have an if statement, if else statement, whatever. You can completely dynamically configure that query that should be executed in the end. Now, where does that user underscore come from? Well, the thing is, what I also did is, to get this working, I had to modify the POM XML file, and I added the Hibernate JPA model generator library to it. And you also need the JAXB runtime for it to work. Now what happens, every time you compile your project, the compiler plugin will have a look at the user class and then automatically generate on the target generated sources a user_helper class. So you don't have to generate to reference your columns by string names, but rather you have these code constants you can refer to. Hence, in our query here, we didn't have to write, well, the name column needs to be something. In fact, we could just reference user_dot_name. It's type safe that way. As I said, it does the job. It's not great, but again, at least 100 pages on that in the official documentation or in the persistence book. Enjoy. All right, that was a lot. Now let's see how we can make your life using Hibernate a bit easier. What essentially you want to do is, what I would recommend you do is, have a look at what IDEs can offer you, like IntelliJ Ultimate, for example. You already saw at the beginning that whenever I added the mapping annotations, IntelliJ was already smart enough to tell me, hey, you're missing some annotation here and there. But what's actually super cool is that IntelliJ can give me autocompletes automatically for example, my user here with the fields, and even tell me, hey, there's no such field as birth in my user class, yeah, stuff like that. So you don't have to, boot up your application. You will immediately see it here in your IDE. Even more so, what you can do is you can select the whole thing and say run query in console, specify, for example, your Hibernate config XML file. It's going to take a tiny second, but no, down here you can actually see we just executed the HQL against our database and we got the users back down here. Also super useful. There's actually a gazillion of features that IntelliJ offers when it comes to Hibernate/JPA. It's just to tease you a bit here. Have a look at yourself how that is helpful for you or not. In addition, I'd recommend you to use a plugin called JPA Buddy, also super cool. It has a ton of features I can't get into, but just to get you teased again, for example, what you could do instead of having to write your user class yourself with all these mapping annotations, what you could do is simply right-click JPA entities from the database, and then you have a nice little wizard where JPA Buddy tells you, you want to create from the user table with these columns, you want to create a class, I can do that automatically for you. And you don't have to worry about, doing all of this stuff manually. JPA Buddy can do a lot more. Just have a look at the website. Again, a starting point for you to explore. But just keep in mind, whenever you're working with the whole JPA universe, make use of what IDEs can offer you. Okay, I've been babbling enough about Hibernate and JPA. Let's just finish off with giving you a quick context of how this relates to you using a framework like Spring Boot or Spring Data. Under the hood, what they do is they also have to use an entity manager factory / SessionFactory. So what Spring Boot does, for example, for you, instead of you having to use an Hibernate config XML file or Java persistence configuration file, you can create an entity manager automatically by just putting a couple of properties inside application.properties. That's it. In the end, Spring Boot will create an entity manager for you. That's number one. So this infrastructure plumbing. Number two, when using Spring, you wouldn't use programmatic transaction code like beginning and committing transactions down here. What you would do is you would use the transactional annotation, right? Spring will make sure that a transaction is open and closed, when the method begins, when Spring steps out of the method. That is the second biggie, the whole transaction management topic. The third biggie is repositories, because for now we have to write these strings here, blah, blah, blah. And what Spring Data offers you specifically is these repositories. By the way, that's just pseudocode. So you would simply write an interface user repository and have a method find by name, and maybe even give it a name parameter, and you will get a list of users back. Now, what Spring Data does is it will automatically turn all of this into the appropriate Hibernate/JPA code for you. You don't have to worry about writing the SQL and whatnot. It's just a huge help, a huge boost for your productivity, hopefully. But that's the three big things: infrastructure, transaction stuff, repositories, and I guess a couple more things which I just forgot. All right, that's it. I hope you found it useful. Now go buy that book, read the 700 pages, work through them, come back in 2 years. Well, actually, before that, let me know how you found the video in the comments, subscribe, and thanks for watching. Sayonara.